and we are looking at studying and immersion-based learning. So studying is, of course, what we can think of as what we typically do for language learning, as going through the drills, studying flashcards, things of that nature. And immersion-based learning, we typically think of that as going to a country that speaks that language, listening to the language, constantly being immersed in that language, right? Well, studying and immersion-based learning definitely are two somewhat separate categories, but there is, of course, an overlap between the two, and that is really the sweet spot for language learning, and that is our goal of where we want to be. So immersion is, of course, that example of going to the country, using that language, but it does not have to be that way. It doesn't have to be like just because you can't go to that country or are in that country does not mean that you can't do immersion-based learning. And just because you are in a country studying that language does not mean that you don't use study techniques that you would otherwise use if you were not in that country. So immersion-based learning and studying, what we really want to create here is an environment where we are receiving passive learning, passive knowledge, like you would have in an immersive environment, right? So you have that, of course, if you're in that country, you have a bit more of this, but you can create that environment for yourself within your home, within your studies, within anything that you do by listening, of course, but also by reading, writing, and speaking, and having that integration of all of those, and just having as much exposure to the language as possible. Now, where studying comes in here is that it is very important to have all of these pieces of immersion, but it is equally important to have studying because we need to be able to target areas that we need to just remember, that we need to, like a drill and kill, get those concepts in. And then once we have that, the immersion-based learning will activate those pieces when we use it. So we study. We use immersion-based learning, we do immersive reading, writing, speaking, listening, we do a little bit of study, some more immersion, and we kind of bounce back and forth between the two. We might spend a little more time in one than the other at different stages in our language learning process, but the idea is that we do use both. We use both intensive studying and immersion, and both are necessary parts of the language learning process. So, the studying, although we tend to think of that as, like I mentioned, as vocabulary memorization, grammar, drills, things like that, studying can also be some of those reading, writing, speaking, listening techniques. There's also intensive reading, speaking, listening, writing techniques that are a form of studying because of their intensive nature. So say that you are reading a book like I showed you in my reading video a little while back, and you are going through and you're looking at words, you're writing, you're reflecting. That is intensive reading. That is like studying, right? But it's also a form of immersion by reading. So though in that situation you are actively using the two, and that is improving your overall fluency, but it's not as well, it's active, it's not passive, as say if you're reading something that is more at your level, you're able to read it without having to expend too much energy to look up new words, to study the grammar, comprehend what you're reading. You can achieve your fluency through that way as well, through your passive practice. And typically what we think of immersion is like easy learning, right? Well, it can be those two ways. We can have immersion that is like at our level where we're not really, working too hard, the studying part really. And then there can be immersion where we are also working hard throughout the learning process. So there's those two different versions, and there's honestly just an infinite amount of versions and ways that you can studying through immersion, through all of these different pieces, and this is just an introduction to each of these ways of learning and studying and improving fluency. And I will have more for you guys of some kind of language learning topic in the next videos. Bye guys!